Have you ever noticed, the harder we try to hold life together, the more it slips through our fingers? We plan, we strive, we perfect, and still something falls apart. Why is that? Could it be that what feels like falling apart is actually life inviting us to fall into place? In this episode of Lotus Light Teachings, we'll explore a powerful truth rooted deep in Buddhist wisdom, that surrender is not giving up, it's waking up. We'll sit with the storms, not to silence them, but to hear what they're trying to teach us. And stay with me until the end, because I'll share a story about a monk, a lightning strike, and a moment of raw truth that might just shift how you see every struggle you've ever faced. If that stirs something in you, not answers, but a quiet longing, then come walk this path with me. You don't need to know the way. You just need to take one step. Subscribe and let's begin together. Chapter 1. The moment everything fell apart and what it opened inside me. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, kept my head down, and did everything right, life would unfold the way I wanted. That comfort would come, that the storm would pass before reaching my door. But life, at least the kind that awakens you, rarely shows up that way. It wasn't one single moment that shattered me. It was a slow unraveling, a silence that crept in between conversations, a growing emptiness beneath accomplishments that once thrilled me, a lingering sadness after the lights went out and no one was watching. I remember sitting alone one evening, bare feet pressed against the cold floor, rain tapping softly on the window like a rhythm I was too tired to dance to. Everything looked fine from the outside, but inside I was crumbling, quietly, invisibly. That was the night I stopped pretending I was okay. And oddly, beautifully, that was the night something opened inside me. Not joy, not peace, not yet, but space. Space for something honest, something real. And that's where this story begins, not with triumph, but with tenderness, with brokenness. Because sometimes the doorway to awakening isn't a sunrise, it's a storm. Sometimes life breaks you open so that something true can finally breathe. We don't talk about that enough, do we? The quiet devastation that isn't dramatic enough for headlines, but deep enough to steal your sense of self. The nights when you lie awake asking questions like, why is this happening to me? Or what did I do wrong? Or the hardest one of all, what now? But if you're here, listening, watching, breathing alongside these words, I want to offer you something sacred. Not an answer, but a companionship through the question. Because in Buddhist wisdom, suffering is not a punishment. It is a call to return, a call to awaken, a call to see what has always been waiting under the surface of all your striving. Your truest self, unguarded, compassionate, alive. There's a story I once heard, simple but searing, from the old Zen tradition. A monk had been meditating under a Bodhi tree for many years, seeking enlightenment. One night, a storm rolled in, fierce and unrelenting. Lightning cracked open the sky, thunder shook the earth beneath him. But the monk did not move. Then, suddenly, a bolt of lightning struck a tree beside him. And in that flash, just for a second, he saw something deep within himself. His own fear, not the fear of death, but the fear of being empty, unseen, alone. And he wept, not out of weakness, but out of recognition. Because in that raw, electric moment, he realized something no amount of quiet meditation had revealed. That the storm was his teacher. That his fear was not the enemy. That the breaking was the beginning. He didn't reach enlightenment in that instant, but he did begin again. More honest, more open, more human. That story stayed with me. Maybe because it reminded me that awakening isn't always found in stillness. Sometimes it comes roaring in, cloaked in chaos, carrying a truth we've avoided for too long. The Buddha never promised a life without pain. In fact, the very first of the Four Noble Truths is that suffering is part of life. But what he also taught, so gently, so radically, is that while pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. That's not a dismissal of grief. It's an invitation to meet it differently, to be with it instead of running from it, to learn from it instead of numbing it, And I know that's easier said than done. I've run from pain. I've buried it in busyness. I've dressed it up in achievement. I've ignored it until it screamed so loud I couldn't hear anything else. But eventually, we all reach a point where pretending doesn't work anymore. And strangely, beautifully, that's where the work begins. There's an image that comes to mind when I think of suffering through the lens of Buddhist wisdom. Imagine a piece of gold, raw and impure. In order to shine, it must go into the fire. Not to be destroyed, but to be refined. The fire doesn't hate the gold, purifies it. Life is like that. It throws us into fire not because we're broken, but because something sacred inside us is ready to be revealed. I've seen it again and again. A friend who lost everything, her job, her home, her partner, only to find herself traveling the world with nothing but a backpack and a journal. She told me she had never felt more alive. A man who walked through addiction and came out the other side not with shame, but with compassion for himself and others. A woman who, after a divorce she didn't see coming, found her voice in a poetry class she almost skipped. Now her words help others heal. And me? I found peace not when life gave me what I wanted, but when I sat with what I didn't want and listened. Listened without judging, without fixing, without rushing. It wasn't easy, and it still isn't. But every time I choose to meet pain like a teacher instead of an enemy, something shifts. My heart softens, my breath deepens, my world widens. That's what suffering can do when we allow it to be sacred. There's a line I once read, "The wound is where the light enters." And I used to think that was poetic nonsense until I lived it. Because my wound, it made me humble, it made me kind, it made me real. And in that space, something began to grow. Not in spite of my suffering, but because of it. So if you're in the middle of something right now, something that feels too big, too heavy, too raw, please hear me when I say you're not lost. You're being reshaped. You're not being punished. You're being prepared. And I know you might not see it yet. I know it might feel like the light is gone. But trust me, light has a way of returning when we stop trying to chase it and start letting it in. Maybe not all at once. Maybe not in the way you imagined. But slowly, gently, like the first sunbeam after a long night. Like a lotus pushing through the mud. Not because it wants the mud to disappear, but because it trusts that something beautiful waits above. And so do I. I trust that whatever is breaking in you right now is also opening something. Something worth discovering. Something already whole. Something more you than you've ever allowed yourself to be. So stay with it. Stay with yourself. Not to fix, not to change, but to witness, to be. Because sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is sit beside your pain and say, I see you. I'm here. I'm not afraid to know you anymore. That is the beginning of awakening. And that's exactly where we're meant to be. I used to let the smallest things ruin entire days. A sharp word from someone I cared about. A glance that felt too cold. Even an email that didn't get answered fast enough. Sounds silly when I say it now, but in the moment, felt heavy, like I was drowning in it. Maybe you felt that too. Those times when a minor setback swells into a storm, and suddenly, everything feels off. Like your heart is a little too tight in your chest. Like your breath is shallow, and no matter how hard you try, you just can't shake that unsettled feeling. I remember one morning in particular, years ago now, I had spilled tea on a letter I had meant to send, burned the toast, missed a work call, and by 9 a.m. I was spiraling. My thoughts kept looping. Why does this always happen to me? Why can't I just get it right? Looking back, that moment wasn't about burnt toast or soggy paper. It was about the size of the container I was holding life in. And that brings me to a story, not a grand one, just one of those quiet teachings that slips into your soul and stays there, like a whisper. There was once a young disciple, weary from the world, who went to his master. His voice was bitter, his shoulders hunched. He said, "Everything feels too much. My problems are endless. My heart is tired." The master didn't answer. He simply asked the disciple to bring him a handful of salt. When the disciple returned, the master handed him a glass of water and said, "Put the salt in this and drink." The disciple did. He sipped, and he grimaced. "Too bitter," he said. The master nodded. Then he led the young man outside to a large, quiet lake. Birds chirped overhead, and the morning air smelled of pine and morning dew. The master said gently, "Now, put the same amount of salt into this lake." The disciple obeyed. The salt disappeared without a trace. "Now drink." The young man knelt, cupped the water in his palms, and drank. He looked up, surprised. "It's clear, clean." And the master said, "The salt hasn't changed, only the container did. So it is with your suffering. Don't carry it in a glass. Become the lake." I remember the first time I heard that story. I was still holding life in a glass, still letting every inconvenience and disappointment stain the water I drank from, still reacting instead of resting in the truth that some pain is too sharp for a small vessel, but never too much for a spacious heart. Suffering, after all, is part of life, but the shape we give it, that's up to us. There's a kind of freedom in that thought, a gentle power, because it means we don't have to get rid of all discomfort to find peace. We only need to become wide enough to hold it. I started noticing how often I contracted around my problems, how my mind would narrow when someone cut me off in traffic or disagreed with me, how my breath would shorten, how I would make the situation about me. My worth, my effort, my failure, everything felt personal, even when it wasn't. I remember standing in line at a pharmacy once, exhausted after a long day, and the woman behind the counter was short with me. My instinct was to react, to fume, to silently curse the unfairness. But then something shifted. I paused. I took one slow breath, then another, and instead of tightening, I softened. I looked at her eyes, tired, overwhelmed, and it occurred to me, maybe she was carrying something heavy too. Maybe this moment wasn't about me at all. In that pause, I became the lake, and just like that, the bitterness dissolved. Not because the moment changed, but because I did. That's what mindfulness teaches us. Not how to avoid suffering, but how to widen the space around it. How to breathe when our chest tightens. How to notice the first ripple before it becomes a wave. How to turn our small glass into a vast lake, one breath at a time. It's not easy, and it's not instant, but with practice we can learn to shift. When I feel myself shrinking into reactivity now, I ask, what's the size of my container in this moment? And then I gently stretch it, sometimes with a long breath, sometimes with a hand on my heart, sometimes by just imagining the sky above me and remembering how much more there is than this one feeling, this one moment. I once knew someone, a client years ago, who had a habit of breaking down over what most would call small things. A misplaced phone charger, a late reply, cluttered desk. She came to me in tears one afternoon, ashamed of how sensitive she was. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she said. "I just feel everything too much." But the more we spoke, the clearer it became. Her life had trained her to live in a very small space. Emotionally, spiritually, she had spent years walking on eggshells, trying not to upset anyone, trying to control everything around her to feel safe. Of course, the smallest change felt overwhelming. Of course, a little salt was too much. She wasn't broken. She was just living in a cup when her soul was meant to be an ocean. And over time, we worked not on fixing her sensitivity, but on honoring it, expanding the vessel around it, learning to sit with the discomfort without drowning in it, learning to trust that her heart could grow big enough to hold it all. And it did. So can yours. So can mine. You see, we don't have to fear intensity, or sadness, or anger, or uncertainty. We only need to stop trying to fit them into a teacup and start letting them dissolve into something wider. Presence, compassion, patience. It reminds me of sitting by a temple pond in Chiang Mai. Early morning, the air still cool from the night, with monks sweeping the grounds gently in rhythmic strokes. Leaves drifted down and settled on the surface of the water without a sound. And I remember thinking, this is how I want my mind to be. Not empty, but still enough to receive whatever falls, and spacious enough to hold what comes, without letting it sink me. It's funny, Really, how often we think peace means escape. That to feel calm, we have to rid ourselves of the chaos, the noise, the salt. But Buddhist wisdom doesn't ask us to eliminate anything. It asks us to expand, to soften into awareness, to witness the salt without letting it define the water. Sometimes now, when I catch myself reacting, tightening, bracing, I pause. I picture that lake. I remember the taste of clear water, and I whisper inside, "Make me wide again." And slowly I return. That's the beauty of this practice. You don't have to fix everything. You don't have to silence your pain. You only need to become large enough to hold it all with grace. So if today feels bitter, if someone hurt you, or the world feels too loud, or your heart is tired of trying, remember the story. Remember the lake. Remember that you are not a glass. You are vast, deep, capable of more softness and space than you can imagine. And every breath, every pause, every moment of noticing is another ripple toward peace. You don't need to be unshaken to be strong. You don't need to be empty to be calm. You only need to let your heart grow wide enough for everything to float. That is the path. That is the practice. And you, dear one, you are already walking it. Chapter 3. The river that carries us home. You ever feel like you're trying to hold your whole life together with duct tape? I mean, really, one thing goes wrong, and suddenly it all feels like it's falling apart. You're trying to keep up, make plans, fix what's breaking, hold on to what's leaving, all while pretending you're fine. I've been there. There was a time in my life when I thought if I just worked hard enough, made all the right moves, stayed one step ahead, then maybe, just maybe, I could keep everything under control. But life had other plans. It was like trying to stand still in the middle of a rushing river. No matter how tightly I held on, things kept slipping through my fingers. People changed. Plans fell apart. The ground shifted under me when I least expected it. And the truth is, the more I fought it, the more I suffered. I didn't know it then, but I was fighting the current. Took me years, and a whole lot of struggle, to realize something that now feels so obvious. You can't control the river. You can only learn to flow with it. One evening, I'll never forget this. I was doing something completely ordinary, washing dishes. The kitchen was quiet, soft music playing in the background, my hands in warm water. It had been a hard week. I just lost a project I had poured my heart into, and I was feeling small, angry, disappointed, like the universe had turned its back on me. And then this little thought floated up, as clear as the sound of the spoon tapping the sink. What if this is happening for you, not to you? I stopped scrubbing. I looked out the window. It was fall, and leaves were drifting down from the trees in the backyard. They weren't clinging. They weren't panicking. They were just letting go. And suddenly I saw it. I was the one clinging, the one fighting, the one trying to tape everything back together when maybe, just maybe, it was time to let something fall. That's when I started to understand something I'd heard in Buddhist teachings, but never really felt until that moment. Surrender isn't weakness. It's wisdom. The saying, I don't know where this river is going, but I trust it's leading somewhere I need to be. There's a story I love about a man caught in a storm at sea. The waves are wild, and he's struggling, desperate, trying to stay afloat. He kicks, he fights, he panics. But the more he resists, the more he sinks. And then, completely exhausted, he lets go. And the current carries him gently back to shore. That's Dharma, the natural flow of life. The deeper current we don't always see, but that's always there. We can resist it, sure, but it'll still be moving, still unfolding, still leading us even when we don't understand where or why. And if we stop fighting, we just might find peace. There's this beautiful idea in both Buddhism and Taoism called Wu Wei. It means non-doing or effortless action, but it doesn't mean being passive or lazy. Not at all. It means learning how to move with life instead of constantly pushing against it. It's like watching a river flow. It doesn't try to force its way uphill. It doesn't complain when it meets a rock. It simply curves around it and keeps moving. I remember this one moment. I was visiting a monastery in the mountains. Morning mist curling around the trees. The world so quiet you could hear your own breath. and I sat there watching a leaf fall into the stream. It floated for a second, caught the current, and drifted gently down the water. That's it, I thought. That's what I want my life to feel like. Not passive, but peaceful, aligned, trusting the flow. Of course, letting go doesn't always feel peaceful at first, especially not when it means surrendering things we care about. Plans, people, dreams we thought were ours to keep can feel like failure, like giving up. But surrender isn't about giving up. It's about giving over, handing things back to the rhythm of life and saying, I'll keep walking, but I won't drag everything behind me anymore. It reminds me of something a monk once said to me. He had lived in silence for years, no phone, no email, no noise, just stillness. I asked him how he stayed sane. He smiled and said, "The mountain speaks when you stop shouting at it." That one stuck with me, because I realized how loud I'd been, how much mental noise I was carrying around. Plans, worries, second-guessing, what-ifs, should-have-saids. And all of it, me shouting at the mountain. What I needed was to listen, to stop fighting, to start hearing. That's what Dharma really is, at least in the way I've come to understand it. It's not about rules or rigid paths. It's about tuning in to the flow beneath everything, the quiet order behind the chaos, the wisdom in the unfolding. And when we listen, we realize that things don't always fall apart. Sometimes they fall into place. I've seen it over and over in my own life, in people I've worked with, in stories that seem small until you look closer. One friend of mine lost his job out of nowhere, just gone, no warning. And at first, it devastated him. He felt like he'd failed his family, like life had turned against him. But with time and a whole lot of breathing, he found space to reconnect with himself, to write again, to see his kids more, to build something new. He told me later, it felt like drowning at the time, but it was the current I needed. I think it brought me back to myself. That's the thing, right? Sometimes the storm we're in isn't here to destroy us. It's here to deliver us. And when we stop thrashing, we start floating. So how do we practice that? Not in some fancy, spiritual only on Sundays kind of way, but right here, in the real, messy day-to-day. For me, it's pausing before reacting. It's asking myself, am I holding too tight? It's choosing not to send the angry text. It's walking slower when my mind wants to rush. It's sitting with uncertainty like a friend, instead of treating it like a threat. It's whispering, okay, life, I'll trust you, even now, because control is comforting, but it's also an illusion. And peace doesn't come from holding tighter, it comes from opening wider. There's a Zen saying I love, let go or be dragged. And believe me, I've been dragged, more times than I care to count. But every time I finally loosen my grip, even just a little, I feel myself coming back to the moment, back to breath, back to trust. And maybe that's what surrender really is. Not a grand gesture, not a dramatic exit, just a quiet choice to stop fighting the river, and instead, let it carry you, because where it's taking you, it just might be home. I once believed that if I just planned everything carefully enough, life would go exactly the way I wanted. I'd wake up with a to-do list, a 5-year plan, a backup plan for the backup plan. I kept receipts for everything literal and emotional. I tracked conversations in my head, replayed them, rewrote them. I even had imaginary arguments with people who never showed up. Looking back, I wasn't really living. I was managing my days, my feelings, my expectations, managing disappointment before it even had a chance to knock. But no matter how much I planned, life kept rewriting the script. The truth is, I was holding on so tightly because I was afraid of the unknown, afraid of failure, afraid of the messiness of being human. And I didn't have the tools, yet, to meet that fear with anything other than more control. Until the day life gave me a lesson I couldn't spreadsheet my way out of. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays are when I used to feel the most in control. The weekend rush had passed, and Monday's chaos had settled. Tuesday felt clean, predictable. That morning, I had everything lined up just right. A work project ready to launch, a lunch with someone I cared about, A doctor's appointment scheduled weeks in advance. And then, everything unraveled. The project crashed, some technical glitch no one saw coming. The lunch was canceled last minute. And the doctor's office called to say they double-booked and needed to move my appointment out another month. Each thing on its own would have been fine. Annoying, sure, but survivable. But put them all together on a Tuesday, and something inside me cracked. I felt this tightness in my chest, like the world was spinning too fast and I couldn't grab onto anything solid. I stood there in my kitchen, arms crossed, heart pounding, and I muttered aloud, angrily, almost like a prayer I didn't mean, "Why can't things just go the way I planned?" There was no answer, of course, just the hum of the fridge and the soft ticking of the wall clock. But I remember looking out the window and noticing a bird, this little sparrow hopping along the fence. No schedule, no control, just hopping, pausing, then flying off into the wind like it trusted where it was going. And I had to ask myself, why was I trying so hard to stop the river? There's an old story from the Buddhist tradition that I love, one that found its way into my heart that same week. A king once gathered his 3 most trusted advisors and asked them a question that had been bothering him for years. Why is life so unpredictable? Why can't I control what happens? The first advisor said, "It's luck, my king. Life is ruled by chance." The second said, "It's karma. Every outcome is the result of past choices." But the third advisor said nothing. He just invited the king to follow him. They walked to a nearby river, calm and wide. The advisor asked the king to try and stop the water with his bare hands. The king, of course, laughed. "That's impossible." But he tried anyway. He bent down, pressed his hands against the current, tried to hold it back. The water slipped right through. Exasperated, he looked up, and the advisor said simply, "Life is like this river. You can try to control it. You can resist, but the current will always move. The only thing you can truly choose is how you move with it." I think about that story all the time, because most of our suffering doesn't come from what's happening. It comes from our fight against what's happening. It comes from our belief that if we just tried harder, we could keep everything exactly as it is, or exactly as we imagine it should be. But the river doesn't work like that, and neither does life. It took me a long time to realize that control is just another word for fear in disguise. We think we're being responsible, organized, prepared, but often we're just scared to let go. Scared to admit that we don't actually know what's coming next. Scared to trust something beyond ourselves. And yet, when we do let go, even just a little, something shifts. We soften. We breathe deeper. We stop bracing for impact. There's a practice in Buddhism, one that's been like a balm to me over the years. It's the art of acting without attachment to outcome. We still do what we can. We still show up, speak with kindness, make choices that align with our values. But we don't tie our peace to the results. We plant the seed, but we don't yank at it, demanding it bloom faster. We speak our truth, but we don't cling to how others respond. We offer love, but we don't demand it return in a specific form. That's not apathy. That's freedom. And honestly, it's hard. It's really, really hard. I still catch myself trying to grip outcomes. Still feeling that old tightness when things don't go how I imagined. But these days, I pause. I ask myself a simple question. Is this a moment to act or a moment to let go? And sometimes that pause is enough to shift the entire energy of the day. I had a friend recently tell me about a time she completely released control over a situation with her teenage son. They'd been fighting for weeks, communication breaking down, trust fraying. She tried everything, rules, advice, pleading. And finally, she said to him, "I'm here. I love you. I trust your journey, even when it scares me." She told me it was the hardest sentence she'd ever said, because it meant letting go of control, of timelines, of needing to be right. But that sentence, those few words, opened a door between them. Sometimes the softest surrender creates the strongest connection. There's a beauty in not knowing, a strange, quiet magic in allowing. And if I'm honest, some of the best things in my life have come not from tight planning, but from the space that opened when I let go. The project that failed made room for a calling I didn't know I had. The friendship that drifted taught me how to truly be with myself. The moments that didn't go to plan led me to this exact path, sharing these stories with you right now. So maybe you're holding on to something too tightly today. Maybe there's a plan that keeps falling apart. A relationship that isn't unfolding the way you hoped. A future that feels too far away, too uncertain. Maybe just for a moment you could try unclenching, not giving up, but letting go. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find that the river has been waiting all along to carry you someplace even gentler than you expected. Here's a reflection I return to often. Maybe you'll find it helpful, too. Can I remember a time when life surprised me in a good way? When letting go actually led to something better? If your answer is yes, hold that memory close. Let it remind you that life has a rhythm far wiser than any plan we could make. And if your answer is no, then maybe your story is still unfolding. Either way, you're not alone in the water. We're all just learning how to float, how to trust, how to live, not manage, this strange, beautiful thing called being human. And the truth? You're doing better than you think. I used to think that if things started falling apart, it meant I had failed, that I had done something wrong, that maybe I had missed a sign, taken a wrong turn, or said yes when I should have said no. So whenever life got messy, and it did often, I'd panic. I'd scramble to fix it, to tape it back together with whatever I had. I thought chaos meant I was being punished. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. I started seeing the cracks differently. I started realizing that maybe what was breaking wasn't meant to be held together. Maybe what was crumbling wasn't me. It was just the shell around me. And maybe, just maybe, chaos wasn't here to destroy anything at all. It was here to let something grow. Took a long time to learn that. And if you're in the middle of it right now, if something in your life feels like it's falling apart, please stay with me. I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me back when I was sitting in the rubble of my own plans. Sometimes things have to break so the light can finally get in. There's this image I love. Maybe you've heard it too. A seed has to crack open in the dark, deep underground before it can ever become a tree. If the seed stays whole, it never grows. But when it splits, that's when everything begins. And isn't that true of us too? The times I grew the most weren't the times everything was smooth. They were the times something shattered, an identity, a belief, a comfort zone, and I had no choice but to rebuild from the inside out. I remember one moment vividly. Years ago, I lost a job I had poured my heart into. It wasn't just a paycheck. It felt like my purpose, my proof that I mattered. And when it ended, not by my choice, I spiraled. I cried in the car, in the shower, even in the produce aisle of a grocery store while trying to choose a bunch of bananas. Funny how breakdowns don't care where they happen. Everything felt raw, exposed. I had no idea who I was without that role. But after the noise settled, there was this strange stillness. I wasn't doing anything impressive. I wasn't anyone special. And yet, I was still here, still breathing, still capable of love and kindness and laughter, though it took a while to find that again. That space, that cracked open space, is where the real growth began, because I started asking different questions. Instead of, how do I fix this? I began asking, what wants to be born here? Instead of, why did this happen to me? I asked, what is this trying to teach me? And those questions changed everything. It's strange how chaos works like that. It sweeps in like a storm, loud and unwelcome. But when it leaves, it often reveals a whole new landscape underneath. I once read about a forest that only regenerates when fire passes through. The seeds of certain trees won't even open unless exposed to intense heat. Without fire, the forest stays stuck. But with it, new life begins. I think our hearts are like that sometimes. We don't choose the fire, but when it comes, it wakes us up, burns away the dead things, makes room for something honest. There's a story that lives deep in Buddhist tradition about a butterfly and a cocoon. You may have heard it, but it's worth telling again, especially today. A disciple was walking with his teacher through a quiet forest. They came across a butterfly, struggling to break free from its cocoon. The disciple, moved by compassion, bent down and gently helped the butterfly out. But something strange happened. The butterfly never flew. Its wings were too soft, too undeveloped. The teacher said, "The struggle to break free is what strengthens the wings. Without it, the butterfly cannot fly." I think about that story a lot when I see someone, myself included, going through a hard time. It reminds me that pain isn't always something to be fixed right away. Sometimes, it's the thing that's making us strong enough to soar. And yes, it hurts. Yes, we wish it were easier. But maybe growth doesn't always feel like blooming. Sometimes it feels like breaking, and both are holy. In Buddhism, we don't call chaos the enemy. We call it the teacher, because comfort, while sweet, can lull us to sleep. We cling to what's familiar, even when it's no longer right for us. But chaos wakes us up. It shakes the dust off our dreams. It pulls the curtain back on our false identities. It says, "Here, this is what's real. This is what matters. Now build from here." And that building, though slow, though tender, is where real transformation begins. I remember a woman I met at a retreat once. She had lost almost everything in a house fire. Photos, heirlooms, journals, things that had been in her family for generations. She told me, quietly, with a softness I'll never forget, "I thought I'd lost myself in the fire, but it turned out I was in the ash, waiting to be found." I still get chills when I think about that. She didn't just rebuild a house. She rebuilt her heart. And that's what chaos gives us when we stop running from it. It gives us the chance to come home to who we really are. You don't have to like the breaking. You don't have to pretend it feels good. But you can trust that something sacred is happening, even here, even now. You may not see it yet. That's okay. Sometimes transformation moves slow, like moss growing in the shadow. Sometimes it blooms in silence, like a lotus opening before the world wakes up. But it's happening. I promise you it's happening. So if your life feels messy right now, if you're in between, or undone, or quietly aching, know this: you are not broken. You are becoming. And no amount of chaos can take away what is real inside you. You don't have to hold it all together. You don't have to know the ending. You only have to stay soft enough to let the light in. The seed never knows what the tree will look like, but it opens anyway. And one day, without even realizing how, it finds itself reaching toward the sky. Just like you. Chapter 6. How the struggle teaches you to fly. I used to think that if something was hard, it probably meant I was doing it wrong. If it hurt, I assumed I had failed. If it didn't come easily, I figured maybe it wasn't meant for me. But over time, and after more than a few stumbles, I've come to see things differently. Now I wonder if the struggle itself might be the very thing that gives us wings. I want to tell you a story you've probably heard before, but this time we're going to sit with it a little longer. Let it breathe, let it stretch out like a warm morning in the sun. It's the story of the butterfly, but not the shiny, pretty part where it flutters through the air. No, I'm talking about the part before that, the part we usually skip past. Inside the cocoon, the caterpillar is not simply resting. It's dissolving, literally falling apart. Its old form melts down into something unrecognizable. And for a while, there's nothing but goop, darkness, stillness, and a whole lot of not knowing. That messy in-between stage, that's where the transformation happens. And when it's finally time to emerge, when the wings are formed but still wet, the butterfly begins to push. It strains. It writhes. It works harder than it ever has in its entire short life. And here's the important part. If someone tries to help by cutting the cocoon open, the butterfly survives, but it never flies. Because the very act of struggling through that tight space is what forces blood into the wings. That effort, that resistance, is what gives the butterfly strength. No struggle, no flight. When I first heard that story as a child, I remember thinking, that's so unfair. Why does it have to be so hard for the butterfly? Why not just make the wings work right away? But now I get it, because I've lived in cocoons of my own. Those seasons when everything feels like it's falling apart on the outside, but really, something sacred is being rearranged on the inside. And the strange truth is, we often don't know we're growing wings until life asks us to use them. I remember a time, not too long ago, when I went through what I'd now call my own cocoon phase. From the outside, everything looked okay. But on the inside, I felt stuck, like something was trying to emerge through me, but I didn't know what it was. I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. Old parts of me were fading. Goals that used to excite me didn't mean the same. People I used to orbit around started drifting away. And the thing is, nothing huge had happened. No big breakup, no tragic loss, no massive failure. Just a slow, quiet undoing, like threads coming loose one by one. I tried to fix it at first. Read more, work harder, plan better, distract faster. But the truth? It was time to be still, to let something die so something else could be born. And it was uncomfortable, like sitting in a dark room with no idea when or if the lights would ever come back on. But in that stillness, something began to shift. Not in some dramatic, overnight miracle kind of way. More like the first hint of light before dawn. Soft, slow, almost unnoticeable. I started seeing myself more clearly. Not the version of me that was trying to impress anyone. Not the one checking off lists or chasing the next should. But the quieter version. The one that just wanted to breathe and be and love and serve. That's the thing about cocoons. They're uncomfortable, sure, but they're also sacred. They give us time to soften, to shed, to become. And they teach us how to trust the struggle, even when we don't yet understand what it's shaping us for. There's a teaching in Buddhism that suffering isn't the end of the path. It's the beginning of it. It's the first noble truth. Not because life is cruel, but because life is calling us to look deeper, to wake up, to pay attention to what really matters. We want transformation to feel like a peaceful sunrise, but more often, feels like being cracked open, like outgrowing your old life before the new one has shown up, like being asked to fly when you still feel like goo. But what if that mess is part of the sacred process? What if your resistance isn't a sign you're failing, but a sign you're building strength? There was someone I once worked with, a single dad, mid-40s, 2 kids, quiet but kind. He'd lost his job suddenly after years of loyal work. He came to me not looking for inspiration, but simply trying to make sense of what was happening. He said something I'll never forget. "I feel like I'm in between chapters, but no one told me how to be in the blank space." I nodded because, same. The blank space can be terrifying. But you know what he did? He showed up. He learned to cook simple meals with his kids. He started journaling in the mornings. He picked up a part-time job that allowed him time to reflect, to rest, to reset. And a year later, he'd started a small side business, working with his hands, doing something he'd always loved but never gave himself permission to try. He told me, "Losing that job broke me open, but it gave me my life back." That's the cocoon. It looks like falling apart, but it's actually falling into alignment. The thing is, most of us don't get to choose when the cocoon comes. We just get to choose how we meet it, with resistance or with trust. And I'm not saying trust is easy. Some days it's as fragile as a whispered breath. But each time we choose it, even just a little, we grow stronger. We learn that we can survive the dark. We learn that our hearts are more resilient than we thought. We learn that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just showing up for your own unfolding. So maybe today you're in the cocoon. Maybe things are heavy, unclear, hard to explain to anyone else. If that's you, take a breath with me. Place your hand on your chest. Feel that quiet beating. You're still here, still becoming, still growing your wings, even if you can't feel them yet. And maybe, just maybe, the struggle you're in isn't something to escape. Maybe it's your sacred passage, your becoming, your doorway to the sky. If you're journaling tonight, here's something gentle to sit with. What part of me is growing stronger through this challenge? Don't rush the answer. Let it rise slowly, like mist from morning tea. Because no matter where you are in your process, you are already enough, already worthy, already whole. And one day, maybe sooner than you think, you'll look back on this time and realize this is where you learned to fly. Chapter 7. The season you didn't know you were in. There was a time when I wanted everything to happen now. The healing, the clarity, the success, the love. I'd look at my life like a map, squinting at the path ahead, wondering when the real thing would finally begin. I kept telling myself, this isn't it yet. Just wait. One more step. Then you'll arrive. But life, at least the life that truly teaches you something, doesn't work like GPS. It's more like a garden. Quiet, mysterious, sometimes slow, sometimes still, sometimes blooming when you least expect it. I remember this moment, so simple, really, when I first started to see that truth clearly. It was spring, and I was visiting a quiet temple tucked away in a mountain valley. The morning air was cool but sweet, and the cherry blossoms had just begun to bloom. Not in full color yet, just soft hints of pink unfurling like sleepy eyelids. I sat under one of the trees, watching petals drift gently to the ground with each breeze, and I remember whispering out loud, without meaning to, "They're not in a hurry," and something about that hit me right in the chest. Because I had been in a hurry my whole life, to figure it out, to get it right, to be somewhere other than where I was. But those blossoms, they only opened when the time was right. Not a moment sooner, not for applause, not because someone told them they should, just because it was spring. That image stayed with me. It's still with me now, especially during the seasons of life when nothing seems to be moving, when everything feels like it's paused, like you're just waiting in the wings of your own story. And maybe you're in one of those seasons now, the in-between, the quiet middle, the not yet. If you are, I want you to know, there's nothing wrong with you. You're just in a different part of the garden. Not every season is for blooming. Some are for resting. Some are for rooting. Some are for falling apart so gently you don't even notice the pieces letting go. There's a kind of trust that comes from seeing this, from really feeling it in your bones, that everything unfolds when it's meant to. Not when you force it, not when you earn it, but when the soil is ready, when the light returns, when the soul has softened just enough to stretch open again. I once missed what I thought was the biggest opportunity of my life. It was a job, one I had dreamed about for years. It checked every box, felt aligned with my passion, even had the salary I used to joke about in those someday conversations. And I was close, so close. Final round, reference calls, handshake energy, and then nothing. They picked someone else. I'll be honest with you, I didn't take it well. I spent days trying to figure out what I did wrong. I ruminated, rewrote emails in my head I never sent. I even convinced myself that maybe life had made a mistake. But here's what I didn't know back then. 2 months later, I was asked to lead a small workshop for a group of people I'd never met before. Just a quiet little gathering at a retreat center by the sea. It wasn't a job. It wasn't prestigious. But it cracked me open in a way nothing else had. Because for the first time, I felt home in what I was doing. Like I wasn't performing. I was just being, sharing, serving. And something in me whispered, this is what you were really made for. That missed opportunity, it wasn't a rejection. It was redirection. And the timing, it wasn't a delay. It was a gift I didn't know how to receive yet. In Buddhism, patience is considered a spiritual strength. Not the passive kind of patience where you grit your teeth and wait, but the kind that trusts deeply in impermanence. The kind that says, even this moment is part of the path. Everything changes, everything shifts, and everything, truly everything, comes in its own time. Even awakening, even peace, even you. There's a small story in the Zen tradition about a student who asked his master, how long will it take me to be enlightened? The master replied, 10 years. The student, eager, said, but what if I try really hard? The master smiled, then 20 years. I love that story. It's funny in that wry Zen sort of way. But underneath the humor is a truth I keep coming back to. When we grasp, we delay. When we rush, we forget. When we soften into the season we're in, something deeper can unfold. I think of my own life like that now, not as a race, not as a ladder, but as a slow walk through a changing landscape. Some seasons are bright and full and everything feels alive. Others are cold, still, stripped bare of all certainty. And some are just quiet, like the hush before a song begins. And none of them are wasted. None of them mean I've failed. They just mean I'm still in motion, still learning, still growing. And so are you. Maybe the lesson of the cherry blossoms isn't about beauty at all. Maybe it's about timing. Maybe it's about the quiet wisdom of blooming only when the time is right. And maybe your time is still coming. Or maybe it's already begun, and you just haven't recognized the light in your own petals yet. Here's something I ask myself when I get impatient with my path, and maybe it'll speak to you too. What part of my life is gently preparing to bloom? Even if I can't see it yet, you don't have to rush the answer. You don't have to know the outcome. Just breathe with the question. Walk with it like a friend. And remember this, you are not late. You are not behind. You are not broken because you haven't arrived yet. You are simply in your own unfolding, your own sacred season. And when the moment is ready, when you are ready, the bloom will come. Not because you forced it, but because you allowed it. And until then, be like the cherry blossom, rooted in stillness, patient in the quiet, trusting the sun you cannot yet see. Chapter 8. The teacher you didn't ask for. I used to believe that pain was something to escape. I mean, that's what we're told, right? Avoid it, numb it, fix it. Don't let anyone see it. For a long time, I thought if something hurt, it meant I was off track. Like life had made a wrong turn and I needed to get things back to normal. But now I'm not so sure that normal is the goal anymore. Because some of the hardest moments in my life, the ones I would have erased if I could, turned out to be the ones that taught me the most about who I really am. They weren't pretty. They didn't come wrapped in wisdom. But looking back, they were the teachers I didn't ask for and the ones I needed most. Let me tell you a story. A while ago, someone I trusted deeply walked away. No real explanation, just silence. And I won't sugarcoat it. My heart hurt in a way that felt physical. Like something inside me had been unplugged and I couldn't quite get the lights back on. For weeks, I tried to analyze it, make sense of it, fill in the blanks they left behind. But none of it helped. It just made me feel smaller, hollow, like I'd been left behind by something I didn't understand. But in that quiet space, once the noise of my thoughts had worn itself out, I started noticing something else. Compassion, not just for them, but for myself. For the first time, I started treating my own heart like something sacred, not something broken. I stopped asking what I did wrong and started asking what I needed to learn. And that simple shift, that one question, changed everything. It reminded me of a parable I once heard. One of those quiet Zen stories that lingers in your bones long after you forget the exact words. There was a student who desperately wanted to reach enlightenment. So he traveled far and wide to find a teacher who could guide him. After months of searching, he arrived at the doorstep of a master known for being, let's say, difficult. The master greeted him with silence, then strange tasks, then insults. Nothing the student did was ever good enough. He scrubbed floors, meditated for hours, followed every instruction. Yet the master remained cold and critical. Eventually, exhausted and heartbroken, the student snapped. He shouted, "Why are you being so cruel to me? I came here to learn." And the master finally looked at him, really looked and said, "Everything you feel about me is what you have not yet healed within yourself." That one hits, doesn't it? It did for me, because often the teachers we resist the most, the pain, the rejection, the failure, the uncertainty, are simply mirrors. They show us where we're still clinging, where we're still raw, where we're still waiting for someone else to validate our worth. But once we're willing to see those moments not as punishments but as pointers, everything begins to soften. It doesn't mean the pain disappears. It just means we stop turning it into a weapon against ourselves. A close friend of mine went through a season of illness that lasted almost 2 years. It drained her body, her savings, her relationships. There were days she couldn't get out of bed. She told me, "I used to think I was strong because I never stopped moving. But now I know my strength lives in stillness, in not giving up, even when I can't go anywhere." And that strength, it wasn't something she found in a textbook. It was something she met face to face in the quiet discomfort of not being able to control anything. That's the kind of wisdom that only life's hardest moments can teach. In Buddhist practice, there's this idea that every experience, no matter how painful, is part of the path. Not just the peaceful moments on the cushion or the joyful days in the sunshine. All of it. Because life doesn't separate the sacred from the difficult. It blends them. It's like sitting in a temple garden at sunrise. The way the petals open and fall, all in the same breath. The way the wind stirs both beauty and impermanence. Nothing lasts, but nothing is wasted either. When I look back at the times I fell apart, I see now that something else was quietly falling into place. More patience, more tenderness, more truth, and slowly a deeper love, not just for others, but for the parts of myself I used to push away. The messier parts, the insecure ones, the soft corners I tried to harden. Life taught me that I didn't need to get rid of those parts to be worthy. I just needed to meet them with more kindness. That's the real teaching behind every difficult season. Not how to avoid suffering, but how to be softer in the face of it. How to let it change us, not into someone harder or tougher, but into someone more real. You don't have to be unshakable to be wise. You just have to be willing to sit with the question, what is life trying to teach me through this? Not in a way that blames, not to spiritual bypass the pain, but just to wonder, to open the door a crack, to listen. Sometimes the answer won't come for months or even years. Sometimes you'll find it in a poem or a stranger's story or the quiet pause before sleep. But it will come, because life never stops teaching, and we never stop growing, even when we're in the middle of something hard, especially then. So if you're carrying something heavy right now, some grief, some confusion, some ache that doesn't yet have a name, I want to tell you this: you are not alone. You're not being punished. You're being taught. And this teacher, though unexpected, uninvited, even unwelcome, might just leave behind a gift you didn't know your heart was ready for. More depth, more clarity, more compassion, more you. And maybe one day, not too far from now, someone else will sit beside you in their pain, and you'll know just what to say, not because you read it in a book, but because life once whispered it to you through your own breaking. And in that moment, you'll realize even your hardest chapter was not wasted. It was always part of the teaching. Chapter 9. The calm beneath the waves. I used to believe that peace meant everything outside me had to be still. That once I had the right job, the right relationship, the right plan, then I could finally exhale. No more chaos, no more curveballs, just smooth sailing. But life, in its usual way, had other ideas, because the waves didn't stop coming. And at some point, I realized maybe they never would. Maybe peace isn't the absence of storms. Maybe peace is learning how to ride the waves without losing your breath. Let me take you back to a moment that shifted everything for me. It was a windy afternoon, and I was standing on a small wooden dock by the ocean. Nothing dramatic, just one of those days when the wind feels a little louder than usual, and the sea looks like it has secrets it's not telling. I had been dealing with something heavy, a decision I didn't want to make, the kind that follows you into sleep and wakes you before sunrise. My thoughts were loud, like 1,000 birds circling all at once. I could feel the tightness in my shoulders, that dull ache behind the eyes that comes from overthinking everything. And then I noticed something. A small boat, moored just off the dock, bobbing in the waves. The water was choppy, not dangerous, but restless. The boat swayed hard at times, leaning deep into one side, then the other. But it didn't tip. It didn't capsize. It moved with the sea, not against it. And just like that, something clicked inside me. I had been trying to control the ocean, to still the waves, when maybe all I really needed was to trust my boat. That moment, that simple little boat rocking on the tide, became a metaphor I now return to again and again. Because life doesn't promise still waters. Promises change. Promises movement. And if we wait for calm to come from the outside, we may be waiting forever. But if we can find calm within, that changes everything. There's a story I love from Buddhist tradition. It's quiet and simple, but it carries a kind of truth that sinks deep into the bones. A villager once ran up a mountain path, breathless, to warn the monk who lived at the top. "A storm is coming," he cried. "You need to leave now." But the monk didn't flinch. He simply looked out over the valley, his gaze steady, and said, "If the storm comes, I will welcome it." The villager blinked, confused. "But you could die." And the monk replied, "If I die, I will accept death. If I live, I will accept life. Whatever happens, I will accept it." I remember the first time I read that story, I thought, that sounds terrifying. To let go of control so fully, to stop resisting the storm. But now I see it differently. The monk wasn't passive. He wasn't giving up. He had simply stopped fighting what he couldn't control. And in doing so, he found a kind of freedom most of us spend our whole lives chasing. There's a line in the Dhammapada that says, "Those who are not perturbed by the ups and downs of life, those people live in peace." Not those who avoid the waves, not those who always get what they want, but those who stop clinging when the tide changes. That's the shift. It's not about making the waves go away. It's about finding your center in the middle of them. And you know what helps with that? Your breath. That quiet, steady rhythm that's been with you from the very beginning. It doesn't judge you. It doesn't rush you. It's just there, rising and falling, like a tide of its own, reminding you that no matter what's happening around you, this moment is still yours. I started practicing breath awareness in a more devoted way a few years back. Not in some fancy, incense-lit room, but in the parking lot of a grocery store. I was late. I'd forgotten something. My phone was buzzing, and my chest felt tight. I remember gripping the steering wheel and thinking, I don't have time for this. But then I caught myself. I don't have time to breathe? Really? So I did. One breath in, one breath out. Not perfectly, not dramatically, just gently. And it helped. Not because it solved anything, but because it brought me back to the moment, to myself. And from that small anchor, I could ride the next wave. It doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes peace is just 3 conscious breaths in a storm you can't control. Sometimes it's choosing not to answer the text right away. Sometimes it's taking your shoes off and standing barefoot on grass. Sometimes it's smiling at someone who didn't expect kindness. These small things, they build a foundation, a quiet strength, a reminder that you're not at the mercy of the weather. You have a still place inside. You just have to remember it's there. A woman I once met on retreat told me a story I'll never forget. She had survived a series of losses, her partner, her home, her job, all within 1 year. She described that time as being tossed around in a washing machine with no door. But you know what she said changed her? Not fixing everything, not achieving some kind of spiritual breakthrough, but sitting every morning for 10 minutes and breathing. Just that. It made no sense at the time, she said. But somehow I started feeling held again. Not by anyone else, just by life itself. That's what happens when you drop into the breath. You stop spinning, even if the world keeps turning, even if your plans fall apart, even if the storm rolls in again tomorrow. You learn that you're still okay, still here, still whole, because the waves can't break what's already anchored. And you've always had that anchor within you. It doesn't mean you'll never feel fear, or sadness, or doubt, but it means you don't have to be defined by them. You can let them rise, and fall, and keep breathing, and keep moving, like that little boat I saw years ago, rocking, swaying, still afloat, still strong, still enough. So if you're in a season of uncertainty right now, if everything feels like it's shifting under your feet, please hear this. You're not failing. You're not lost. You're just learning how to trust your boat. Let the ocean do what oceans do. Let the wind pass through your hair. Let the rain fall if it needs to, and come back to your breath. That's all. That's everything. Inhale, exhale, stay. The storm may not stop today, but neither will your strength. Chapter 10. The journey back to where you already are. I used to think that enlightenment was something far away, something mysterious, distant, like a hidden treasure at the top of a mountain I wasn't strong enough to climb. I imagined awakening as this final, golden moment where everything made sense, where I'd sit in stillness, finally untouched by doubt or confusion or pain. But life had a different way of teaching me. And it began not with fireworks or halos or mountain peaks. It began with a bowl of warm soup on a cold evening. It began with the sound of rain tapping the window while I cried quietly in the dark. It began with someone holding my hand and not saying a word. It began, most surprisingly, with the moment I stopped chasing it. Because awakening, it turns out, isn't somewhere out there. It's right here, right now, right in the middle of everything we've been trying to run from. Let me tell you a story that changed the way I see everything. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't make the headlines, but it shifted something in me. Years ago, I was in the middle of what some people might call a spiritual crisis. I was trying so hard to be good at meditating, good at letting go, good at being present, at being loving, at being awakened, which now that I say it sounds a little ridiculous. But it didn't feel ridiculous then. It felt urgent. I was striving towards some invisible finish line, convinced that if I just tried hard enough, I could finally become whole. One evening, I sat outside a temple just as the sun was setting. The wind was soft, and the air smelled like sandalwood and dry leaves. I'd had a rough week. Too many thoughts, too much restlessness, not enough grace. I looked at the sky, tired of myself, and thought, I'm never going to get there. And then this quiet voice inside me, not loud, not poetic, just calm, said, "What if there is no there?" I blinked. It felt like something let go in me that I didn't even know I'd been gripping. What if there is no there? What if the whole time I've been trying to arrive, I've already been home? That moment didn't fix everything, but it changed something, planted a seed. And over time, that seed bloomed into the most unexpected kind of freedom. The kind that doesn't come from fixing yourself, but from finally loving the parts of you you thought you had to fix. The kind of freedom that whispers, you don't need to become something else. You just need to remember who you already are. That's the paradox, isn't it? The thing we're chasing is already here. It's in the breath you're taking right now. It's in the stillness between your thoughts. It's in the softness of your own heart, even when it's breaking. In Buddhism, they sometimes call it the pathless path. Because even though we walk, even though we learn, even though we grow, we're not trying to get somewhere new. We're slowly peeling away everything that isn't us, until we see clearly, maybe for the first time, that what we've been seeking is what we've always been. There's this line I love: you are not being punished, you are being shaped. Feels important to say that again. For someone here who needs it, you are not being punished, you are being shaped. By grief, by joy, by silence, by laughter, by all the ordinary, sacred, messy things that make up a human life. Every event, every mistake, every heartbreak, they're not detours. They're the curriculum, the raw material for your becoming. And if we can hold all of it, not just the pretty parts, not just the calm moments, but all of it, with tenderness, we start to see the truth, that the lotus doesn't bloom despite the mud. It blooms because of it. The cracked places are not where the light enters. They're where the light already was. We just needed to stop covering it up. One of my teachers once said, "You are not on a path to enlightenment. You are walking through your own forgetting until you remember." And that remembering doesn't come with fanfare. It comes in the simplest moments, in the warmth of sunlight on your face, in forgiving yourself again for not having it all together, in letting go of the timeline, in finally exhaling. Sometimes it comes when you're making tea and notice the steam curling like incense, and something inside you goes still, for no reason, and everything feels enough. Sometimes it comes in the middle of pain, when you're not trying to escape anymore, but simply being with what is. And sometimes it comes through someone else's story, a glimpse of truth you didn't know you were carrying too. I met a man once who had spent years looking for the answer. He traveled to different temples, tried different paths, sat with different teachers, but nothing stuck. Nothing gave him what he thought he needed, until one evening back home, he sat by a river he had grown up near. It was dusk, quiet, the water was slow. He told me, it wasn't like I figured something out. It was more like I stopped trying. And that's when I felt it. Not a flash of light, just peace. like I belonged here, like I had never left. I smiled when he said that, because I knew exactly what he meant. We spend so much time trying to fix, improve, evolve. But maybe the most profound thing we can do is come back to this moment, to our breath, to our bare, soft presence, and trust that it's enough. You are not a project to be completed. You're a soul to be remembered. And the path to that remembering isn't straight. It loops, it stumbles, it wanders, it doubles back. But every step, every tear, every belly laugh, every morning you choose to begin again is part of it. There is no wasted chapter, no wrong moment, no missed lesson. You're already walking it. And the only thing left to do is keep walking, with your eyes a little softer, with your heart a little more open, with your hands a little more willing to let go. Because the home you're looking for, you're carrying it with you, in your breath, in your body, in your being. And every moment, every single one, is another chance to come home. Not to some perfect version of yourself, but to the version that's already here. The one who's still learning, still growing, still showing up. The one who has always been enough. Thank you for walking this journey. Whether you're just beginning or you've been on this path for years, you're not alone. You never have been. You never will be. Come back anytime. The door is always open. And the path? It's right under your feet. Right where you are. Welcome home. So maybe peace doesn't come from finally solving everything. Maybe peace is what rises when we stop fighting the river and start floating with it. Maybe you're not falling behind. You're just in the season you didn't know you were in. One that is still gently preparing you to bloom. Like the lotus, you don't rise despite the mud. You rise because of it. Like a boat that stays steady not by silencing the waves, but by trusting its anchor. Tell me, have you ever had a moment where everything seemed to fall apart, but something quietly began to grow inside you? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. It matters. You matter. And if today's story touched something tender in you, subscribe and come back. This isn't just a channel. It's a path we walk, softly, slowly, together. Until next time, breathe, stay open, and trust the light that's already in you.